Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my final review on the new Canon EOS 6D Mark II full-frame camera. And so to start off, we're going to just give you a quick overview of some of the build specifications here and kind of some standout things that I want to highlight. If you haven't already, I would encourage you to take a look at this episode where I break down the build and the design a little bit more thoroughly, and you can get more information there. However, one thing that I do want to really point out is that it should not be underestimated how huge Canon's excellent touchscreen is on this camera. And that's true of Canon's touchscreens in general, which at this point are better than any other camera system that I've used. And I also shoot with some Sony bodies, and Canon's touchscreens are just kind of seemingly light years ahead of those cameras when it comes to the touchscreen functionality. If I could offer up any kind of complaint when it comes to the touchscreen, it's more that I really like the implementation on the EOS M5 of they call it touch and grab. And of course, you can't have the same kind of specification where you just, while you're looking through the viewfinder, you can use your thumb to just touch on the screen and move around where you'd want to focus, while you don't have the same, kind of flexibility as you would with an EVF to just move the focus point anywhere on the screen. I would like to have seen something similar where you could at least select your autofocus point and just very quickly on the fly select an autofocus point via touch that way. And unfortunately, there's nothing that is kind of the equivalent of touch and grab on the 6D Mark II, and I think that was perhaps an oversight. And Canon continues to do an excellent job with the just overall ergonomics of the camera, the way that it feels in your hands, the way that buttons are placed where they should be and operate the way that they should be. On top of that, the menu system continues to be excellent here. It's logical, it's easy to find settings, a little less complex because of having less options than, say, the 5D series, but that can be an upside for those that get overwhelmed by really deep menus. And so Canon does a really great job with that. Another thing that is worth noting after some long-term use of the camera is that the battery life, although it uses the same LPE6N battery that a number of Canon's new cameras have used, the battery life is really exceptional on the 6D Mark II, and particularly when you're accustomed, as I am, to shooting with the 5D Mark IV, which amongst Canon's DSLRs, at least the kind of the upper tier DSLR, starting with the say 70 or 80D series and upwards, battery life tends to be quite good in those cameras, but I found that the 5D Mark IV, that it tends to burn through batteries a lot more quickly than what I'm accustomed to. And so the 6D Mark II, however, is exceptional. And during this entire period where I have been using this camera, I think I've only had to recharge the battery once. And that's pretty amazing. And so you're getting anywhere from, in real world use, I would say that you're averaging 1,300 shots plus on a charge, which is, of course, incredible. Another area where Canon has really improved the 6D series is by drastically improving the burst rate from 4.5 frames per second to 6.5 frames per second, which means that really it is right there with the 5D Mark IV, which has a burst rate of 7 frames per second. And while the 5D Mark IV has a little bit deeper buffer when it comes to, an absolute sense of the number of JPEGs, for example, its figure for a raw buffer is really pretty close to the same, which of course stands to reason considering that the 5D Mark IV doesn't really have any kind of superior card system. While it does have dual card slots, it's the same technology there and thus the same limitations that might come with that. Similar processors, etc. That memory card issue is one thing that a lot of people will have a problem with. You've only got one single SD card slot, and it's only UHS-1 compliant, and so you are limited by a technology that while it has upsides, it's a very simple and reliable system to use. If you're using a laptop, there's a good chance that may be one of the few cards that you can natively just pop into your laptop and read. So all of those things are upsides, of course, but there are obviously a number of options that would allow you for faster transfer rates. And I mean, for me, at least bumping it up to UHS 2 compliance would have helped a lot in this regard. Unfortunately, that's one area where Canon kind of cheaped out with this. Now, moving on to the autofocus system, and I've spent a lot of time now shooting with the camera, and one of the things that I was excited to see initially, when we just saw the specifications, is that it had a similar 45 AF point system to the Canon 80D, which I own and have used a lot, and the Canon 80D's autofocus system is really quite good. It's not as good as my 5D Mark IV, but for all intents and purposes, it gets the job done, except in the most demanding of tracking situations, by comparison. It's really a great autofocus system. And of course, when it came out, it was somewhat revolutionary because it covered so much more of the frame. In fact, on an 80D, that 45 autofocus points covers 62% of the width of the viewfinder and 48% of the height. And so that was all, fantastic. But then, of course, when we first saw the overall grid from the new 6D Mark II, and all of a sudden we saw those same 45 AF points, but all compressed together. And of course, the thing is that we got the 80D's autofocus system, but overlaid over, of course, a much larger full frame sensor. And the sensor area of a full frame sensor is about 2.5 times that of APS-C. So, of course, the downside is that what was 62% of width coverage and 48% of height becomes 39% of width coverage and 30% of height. So as you can see, when it comes to AF point coverage, you're not necessarily working with a whole lot more. In fact, you're working with a slight bit less width on your maximum outer points, although you do get a little bit more height in kind of the upper and lower extreme corner points. And so you can put, maybe a little bit better for working the rule of thirds than what the original 6D was, but, not quite what many people were hoping for in terms of AF, focal point spread on that. The upside is that like the 80D, it inherits the ability that 27 of the central points across the frame are f8 sensitive, meaning that they will work with combinations like Canon's 100-400L Mark II along with the 1.4 times extender, and so it will natively autofocus and do so fairly well, although my experience with this system says that the smaller a grouping you're using, the better results you're going to be. And of course, that compares very favorably to the original 6D, which had 0 f8 sensitivity, and eventually the 5D Mark III, it only had 1 center point sensitivity up to 8 f8 after a firmware update. And so, if you're thinking about using a combination that's a smaller maximum aperture than f5.6, that is a compelling reason to consider the 6D Mark II. And beyond that, of course, you do have some improvement when it comes to tracking due to the greater density of the AF point, so it's easier to keep an AF point lit up. You also have, of course, more options in terms of zone shooting and just more options in terms of AF point selection. And I have run a number of tests and found that, with good focusing lenses, I particularly kind of focused in on a lens like Canon's 35mm f1.4L Mark II. Excellent autofocus on that lens. And I found that I could use the outer AF points without issue, and I got nice repeatability, good accuracy. And so I think those of you that, were kind of stuck in focus and recompose using the center point on the 6D, you may find a little bit more liberty to use other autofocus points with wide aperture lenses like that on the 6D Mark II. Then, of course, one other huge upside is DPAF, and DPAF is amazing. And if you go back after using this camera, I've been using it and the original 6D some side by side, you go back and you try to autofocus in live view, and you forget how incredibly slow live view focus was prior to DPAF. With DPAF, however, it is You know, it is pretty close to instantaneous. I mean, if you just want to touch where you want to focus, it focuses, it takes the shot. It is just that quick. There's no hesitation. It just does it and gets it done. And so, you know, that is a huge upside as well. And DPAF is the best technology of its kind that I have yet encountered. Now, I did another episode where I took a look at some of the sensor performance, and I'd recommend that you look at that here because for sake of time, I'm just going to hit a few high or low points here in this final review. One of the most popular articles that I've ever written on my website, DustinAbbott.net, was an article called Why I Chose a Canon EOS 6D over the 5D Mark III. And of course, I wrote that years ago, right after the 6D had come out. And the reason why I made that statement is that while on a lot of levels, of course, the 6D was not as fully featured as the 5D Mark III, I felt that the overall performance in terms of sensor performance and even some aspects of other performance actually exceeded that of the 5D Mark III, and it left kind of a little bit of a confusion as to which model to choose. I think that Canon wanted to eliminate that kind of conundrum this time around because with very, very, very few exceptions, the 5D Mark IV is pretty much better at everything than the 6D Mark II. And so I think you have a much clearer upgrade path than what you did the first time around. Now on paper, when I saw the specifications of the 6D Mark II, I went down the list and said, yeah, pretty much everything that I thought should be upgraded did get upgraded. And certainly there are a ton of minor upgrades throughout the camera that make it a more functional, better camera across the board. On paper, the original 6D was not all that great a camera, but in real-world use, it was pretty amazing. And a big part of that came down to the great strength of its sensor, which I felt and continue to feel was probably Canon's best from the previous generation. As a result, it's held up really well, and it's left a fairly high bar for the 6D series that, while the 6D Mark II is certainly, I don't think, takes a step back, it doesn't take much of a step forward either. And that leaves a lot of people disappointed. Now, when it comes to the raw resolution, it certainly has a very nice uptick to what I think is a nice point for it, from 20 megapixels up to 26 megapixels, which is a nice sweet spot where you've got some additional resolution without file sizes kind of going crazy. And so that's nice, and it's certainly when I compare images taken side by side between the 6D and the 6D Mark II, I do favor those from the 6D Mark II. But when you begin to push the limits, that was an area where the original 6D held up surprisingly well. And the 6D Mark II, because the competition has changed and improved so much in the last 5 or 6 years, it doesn't really hold up as well under modern examination. I found that when I began to push up to higher ISO levels, despite having a higher native ISO range, I saw more of a magenta cast at higher ISO levels than what I was accustomed to. I also found during my dynamic range episode that dynamic range was certainly lagging behind that of the 5D Mark IV, which is fine, but I felt like even shadow recovery on a basic level was a step back from basically everything that Canon has released since the original 6D. And so that was a disappointment. And when I tried to push shadows, I felt like I got both more noise and also just a loss of detail in the shadows. I found that highlight recovery was pretty close to being on par with like the 80D and just a little bit behind the 5D Mark IV, but shadow recovery isn't even close. And so count me a little bit disappointed when it comes to the sensor. Not to say that this camera can't take beautiful pictures, because I've taken a lot of beautiful pictures with it. It's a very capable camera. It has Canon's great color science, all of that stuff. You can get beautiful images, and in just about every situation, you're going to be able to process those images to get an end result that you want. And, no, its dynamic range is not as good as the 5D Mark IV, but it is good enough for most situations. The question, of course, for a lot of people is good enough in 2017? And I know from your responses that for a lot of you, the answer to that question is no. Another area where I have got some disappointments is when it comes to the video performance, because again, this is a camera that could have been a great video rig. The addition of, for the first time in Canon's full frame cameras, the you know, the touchscreen articulating LCD, which is fantastic. I love Canon's articulating screen and tilting screens that I have, you know, for example, on my Sony camera, or that I've seen on, you know, the EOS M3 or EOS M5. They're not nearly as good or versatile as what this articulating screen is. And I've been using a 70D, still own one, for a number of years, and I've never had any issue with it, with any kind of damage or it not performing right. It has held up exceptionally well. And so that is a great thing. It also has some other improvements. You know, for example, it does have now 60 frames per second at 1080p. That's nice. Unlike the original 6D, you do have manual control over audio, not just before video capture, but during video capture. And it has DPAF, you know, the ability to have AF servo and excellent AF servo tracking during video. All of that is great. But if anything, the video options on the 6D Mark II are actually even more limited than what they were on the original 6D. But when it comes to options on the 6D Mark II, you basically have only two choices. You have a standard IPB, and then you have what they call a light IPB, which is an even lower bit rate. And so you're basically stuck with MP4 no matter what. And of course, MP4 is a fairly highly compressed video option, and as a result, the video footage is really not all that great. And of course, that's particularly true when you consider how exceptional the video footage is from, say, the Sony a6500 that I'm recording on right now, which is amazing in its video performance. So the reality is that we're at a place where people expect a lot more when it comes to the video performance, and frankly, so do I. And there's a reason why I'm not going to personally upgrade to the 6D Mark II, and one of the primary reasons is the video functionality, because I do need 4K video coverage and more video options, and unfortunately the 6D Mark II is not delivering those. So, you know, bottom line is this is a good camera that probably should have been a better camera. I think that users of this camera will enjoy it, and there's going to be a lot of people that rightfully so defend it because it does what they want it to do. It handles great, it takes great pictures, it does all those things, and I'm not trying to discredit it in any sense. It also has a number of recent Canon features that I'm going to run through in just a moment that make it a much more complete camera than what the 6D is. But it could have been so much better, and there seems to be a number of places where it is either intentionally or unintentionally limited in a way that is frankly unacceptable at this point in time. Now, some of the reasons to consider an upgrade, some of you have asked me the question, should I get the 6D Mark II or a 5D Mark III, you know, which you can get for roughly the same price. My answer to that is that I personally would go with the 6D Mark II. Number one, it does have a better sensor and better performance when compared with the 5D Mark III. And of course, it gives you higher resolution, but it's also better in low light. It focuses better in low light. There are a number of areas where it is advanced beyond that. It has DPAF, and DPAF is the dual pixel autofocus is a huge reason to upgrade for both video AF, but then also for just if you're wanting to shoot on a tripod or touch to focus. There's a lot of scenarios where having DPAF is hugely important. That touchscreen articulating LCD is huge, and that's a good reason for updating. Connectivity. The 6D Mark II has, you know, the typical suite of connectivity for these days, Wi-Fi, NFC, Bluetooth. And so these days, there's a lot of reasons why you're going to want to connect wirelessly to your camera. The 6D Mark II allows you to do that, and natively the 5D Mark III doesn't. Another thing that I really like is GPS, and the 6D Mark II has moved up to a GPS module that is similar to that of the 5D Mark IV, which means that it doesn't have the battery drain, and it's just a more user-friendly experience. It has greater center point sensitivity, and I think that's very important if you shoot in low light conditions. It also has things like Canon's anti-flicker technology that if you shoot events is very important when you're shooting with lights that cycle their color temperature, sodium lights, for example. And as a person that shoots a lot of events, I really hate when I'm shooting a burst and I get, you know, very different lighting and color results. And Canon's anti-flicker technology will help to avoid that. So that's important if you're an event shooter at all. Beyond that, it's got important features like, a built-in intervalometer, and so that you can, either shoot, motion capture type things, or you can shoot time lapses. All of those things you can do natively. It does have 5-axis digital IS for video recording, and so while, as I've noted, the video recording is not really exceptional, then again, neither was the 5D Mark III, and this has got a few extra features that may help you in collecting video to augment your stills. And so my kind of in review on the 6D Mark II is that I think that it will make a lot of users very happy, but at the same time, I completely understand why there are a lot of people that say, I'm either going to stick with this original 6D, or I'm going to move to a different camera system. Because while this is a good camera, the competitors are producing at this price point cameras that are arguably better, or at least more fully featured, with the features that photographers in 2017 are looking for. So the bottom line is, it's a good camera. It should have been a better camera. If you look in the description down below, you can find linkage both to my image gallery as well as my written review. You can also find linkage there to either follow me on social media or to become one of my patrons. And of course, if you haven't already clicked that subscribe button, please do so. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.